Today, we are going to talk about a very important topic. We will talk about climate economics. We will look at the various targets set to prevent global warming and we will understand the progress made so far. We will also see if climate change risk is real and how does it impact us financially. Let's first understand the various models and scenarios built for climate change. You would have heard of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and a 4-degree scenario. A 1.5 degree scenario would mean we would restrict temperature rise by 1.5 degrees pre industrial levels. While in each of these scenarios, the temperature difference is not much, but the kind of impact which they can have is completely different. For example, in case of 1.5 degree scenario, almost 14% of Earth's population would be subject to extreme temperature. In case of a 2 degree scenario, that impact is going to go up to 37%. In case of a 2 degree scenario, almost 99% of coral reef is going to get wiped out, versus in case of a 1.5 degree scenario, that impact is 70 to 90%. So we can see that with a 50 basis point increase in temperature, the kind of impact is much more significant, much more broader, and it impacts much larger population. Is 1.5 degree scenario realistic now? Can we restrict temperature rise to 1.5 degrees? While it looked reasonable and realistic couple of years before, but if you look at today's scenario, it is highly unrealistic to expect that we are going to restrict temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Let's look at the CO2 emissions in last couple of years. You will see that except for the COVID year, these emissions have been going up year on year. We used to emit 26.4 billion tons of CO2 in 2002. And that number in 2022 is 37.5 billion tons. That's a big increase in spite of so much effort, so many initiatives which have been talked about. The real emissions have not come down at all so far. Why 1.5 degree goal is unreal now? If you go back to history in 2017, there was an agreement, there was an alignment between global leaders that if we are going to restrict carbon emissions to 570 billion tons till 2050, we could still achieve the target of 1.5 degree temperature rise and not beyond. But what has happened since then? From 2018 to 2023, we are going to emit 250 billion tons already, which means for the next 26 years, we have to restrict ourselves to 320 billion tons. That number is highly unrealistic. We are going to exhaust this target in next 6 years at the rate at which we are emitting carbon now. So a 1.5 degree scenario is highly unrealistic. What we should now focus is if we are going to restrict the temperature rise to 2 degrees, because anything beyond 2 degrees is going to be catastrophic. The sustainability of the planet itself is going to come under a question mark. Let's look at the countries driving CO2 emissions. If you look at the top 3 countries, China, US and India, they account for almost 50% of global emissions. China alone contributes to almost 30% of global emissions, 11.5 billion tons of CO2 emissions just from one country, followed by US 5 billion tons and then India 2.7 billion tons. So these are the 3 countries where there are maximum emissions, but the story completely changes when we look at per capita emissions. Here you will see a big disparity between developed countries and developing countries. If you look at countries like India, that per capita emission is 1.9 tons. But if you compare it with US is at 14.9 tons per capita, which means emission per citizen in US is almost 7 times that of India. If you look at China, the emission per capita is 4 times of India. Therefore, the developed countries have to significantly reduce their per capita emissions, their overall emissions, so that globally these emissions come down. Even for countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, while they are still developing, but they also have to take a fair share of cut in the emissions. We cannot take shelter of the argument that developed countries have already made progress and therefore their entitlement Two, carbon emission is much lower, because if we take that argument, we will continue to generate more and more carbon, and that would be detrimental to the entire climate change fight. So our emissions also have to come down. Now, how does it impact all of us financially? Now, first of all, do not look at climate change just from a financial standpoint. The quality of life that all of us are going to live is going to be significantly impacted due to climate change. All of us can feel the heat. You will see more and more floods. You will see more and more earthquakes. You will see more and more landslides if we do not control climate change, which also has a direct impact on the physical infrastructure. You would have seen what happened recently in Delhi with floods. You would have seen so many landslides happening in the northern part of the country. So much being lost due to flash flood, so much loss of life and physical infra happening. So all of that has to be prevented, and the key lever for that is the fight against climate change. Just imagine what is going to happen to the real estate which is closer to sea. Today, you might fancy having a sea facing house, but what is going to happen in next 15 years? Will that land itself exist or not is still a question mark. Therefore, this fight against climate change has to be very rigorous, has to be very intense, and the carbon emissions have to start coming down starting 2023, because if we do not curtail, if we do not reduce these carbon emissions today, the climate change is going to be irreversible, which means we will not be able to do anything after 10 years, 5 years. The carbon will be in the air, and there would be very limited possibility to reverse the damage. Therefore, let's fight against climate change. Thank you. Jai Hind.